In 1989, Gunpei Yokoi revealed his latest invention, the Game Boy. Released in Japan alongside Tetris, the Game Boy would birth the now $90 billion Pokemon franchise. This revolutionary console was a smash hit and began developing more complex handheld consoles.
There were handheld video game consoles that allowed you to play lots of different games by swapping cartridges, like the Atari Lynx and the Game Gear, and of course the Game Boy. The Game Boy was different to its competitors. Its competitors had colour screens.
So the Game Boy was, even for 1989, quite primitive. It was black and white, its rivals were in colour. It seemed quite retro even in 1989, but because it was a handheld and it was primitive, it could use less batteries, and that meant it was far more portable and reliable. So basically Nintendo beat much more advanced competition by having something that was much more practical.
Gunpei Yokoi's design philosophy was lateral thinking with withered technology. And what that meant is that he didn't want to design a cutting-edge video game system. He wanted to use technology that was already well used and already cheap. And that has been Nintendo's most successful design philosophy ever since.
Super Mario became loved by millions and slowly but surely sealed itself as the brand mascot for the company. When Nintendo was dominating the market, a new competitor joined the scene, Sega, with the release of the SG-1000.
It's quite expensive though, and it's better than watching TV, I think.
I'm addicted to it, Street Fighter.
I like fighting and adventure.
Sega's got more better games, but Nintendo's more sort of fantasy games.
The British market alone is worth more than one Victor Ludorum.
In the 90s, Nintendo were right at the top of their popularity. The Game Boy was out, the Nintendo Entertainment System was out, but Sega were also hot at their heels trying to really recapture some of that market. So while Nintendo had Mario, the friendly Italian plumber, Sega had Sonic the Hedgehog, a cool blue hedgehog. And the contrast was that Mario games were often kind of seen as more family-friendly, more kind of cuddly in a way, and they were quite slow-paced compared to Sonic, which really sold itself on speed. So the Sonic games really positioned themselves as quite edgy, and that really spoke to a lot of teenagers and kids at the time, which meant that Nintendo and Sega ended up kind of battling it out with their mascots for console supremacy.
Danita Stokes, president of HAG.
It's bad enough that Sega Genesis has the most 16-bit games, but this new Sonic the Hedgehog, oh, he really does my doilies. They say he's incredibly fast. Well, what's the hurry, mister? And about his attitude. Smarty pants! Why can't it be more like that nice boy Mario? Oh! Little brat!
Now, get Sonic free when you buy a Sega Genesis system at its new price of $149.99.
The rivalry between Sega and Nintendo was aggressive. They really were going for it at that time. Like, they just wanted to corner the market. So Sega had a slogan on their advertising that was pretty pointed. It was, Sega does what Nintendo don't.
It is what we call eyeballing the kid and actually going up to him and saying, this is Nintendo, this is what it does, go on, have a go, what do you think? And of course, added to that, there's the imagery of Nintendo, which is very important, which the kids also find important. It's a kind of a badge brand because there's a playground battle out there, Nintendo v Sega, and it's important to us that most kids in the playgrounds are talking about Nintendo.
Really what we have here is a format war, just like VHS and beta and video. And of course, every Nintendo sold from our point of view is one person out there not buying Sega software. And this market is all about razors and razor blades, if you like. In other words, we make the money on the software rather than on the hardware. So it's important that we get as big a user base out there as possible.
So Sega during the 80s was always the number 2 console manufacturer, and by number 2 it had 10% of the market, Nintendo had 90%. So, it's not even It's number 2, but the gap is enormous. So as the 90s began, Sega gets ready its new console, the Mega Drive or the Sega Genesis, and decides it's going to fight again and try and win. And it launches a couple of years ahead of the Super Nintendo and basically markets itself at older teenagers. And with the help of Sonic, it breaks through. It sells a few million before Nintendo's even released its own console. So suddenly it's gone from this kind of distant number 2 to an actual serious force. And so the early 90s were this kind of power struggle between Nintendo and Sega. Sega kind of aiming for a slightly older audience, Nintendo aiming for a slightly younger audience. In the end, Nintendo won out. Nintendo eventually managed to outsell Sega, but you know, it was a close run for a good couple of years.
Round 2, fight! Know that fire!
The 90s began with the release of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System and Super Famicom, transcending from 8-bit gameplay to 16-bit. The new console found great success across seas and competed with Sega's new console, the Genesis. It was here that both Nintendo and Sega were considered at war, with Sega releasing the new hit, Sonic the Hedgehog.
Gotta go. Hey, guy, you're the first serious gamer I've seen all morning. Check this out. Brand new 16-bit Super Nintendo with Super Mario World. Wow!
What's this one?
Oh, this is a Sonic the Hedgehog from Sega Genesis. Hey, look at these radical colors, huh?
Wow, Sonic's fast, too.
No, over here.
I like Genesis, and it costs a lot less.
Wait, kid, that game
I'll
there.
take Sonic and Genesis.
I knew that.
Sonic the Hedgehog. More action, more speed. Sega Genesis. It's a whole lot more for less.
With Super Mario 64, GoldenEye, and The Legend of Zelda: The Ocarina of Time, the Nintendo 64 saw the threshold made by the SNES, and Hiroshi looked to surpass it in a grandiose fashion. It was a statement for 3D gameplay and character maneuverability. However, though Atari had beaten Nintendo in the race for dynamic 3D gameplay, Nintendo discovered how to flawlessly execute the newfound dimensions and utilize vector models to enhance the gameplay experience.
When I was a kid, I didn't really even know that the job of game dev existed, but I've always been someone who loved to play games. When I was younger, we actually at home weren't allowed to have a Nintendo 64 or the PlayStation 1, which were the massive consoles at the time. But I had friends who did have those consoles, and I would constantly go over to their houses to play them. We also had a PC at home where I could play really chuggy games on a not very good computer.
In the mid-90s, Gunpei Yokoi was still working for Nintendo, and he wanted to develop a virtual reality system. This was way ahead of its time. He developed what eventually became the Virtual Boy, but it didn't go as planned. Nintendo didn't give him enough time to finish the development, and the final product, he wasn't happy with it at all. In the end, instead of being a portable headset like Gunpei Yokoi had envisaged, it was actually table mounted, and you played it by kind of leaning forward and looking into this lens, and you could see these 3D graphics. It was only one color, everything was red. Playing the Virtual Boy gave you massive headaches. The games were awful. It was a total flop. Gunpei Yokoi was really upset about this because this was not the system he had imagined. And as a kind of apology, he developed the Game Boy Pocket before leaving Nintendo to go off and start his own product development company.
In March 1997, the Nintendo 64 launched in Europe and sold 2.3 million units in the first year. Nintendo introduced the Rumble Pack, which enabled players to feel the realistic vibrations contained in the game. In the early 2000s, Nintendo began its expansion, establishing offices all around the globe. The following years saw the release of the GameCube, building upon the technical prowess displayed by the N64. The Game Boy would continue to undergo upgrades, and soon there would be 6 more iterations of the console, each possessing unique qualities.
So after the Game Boy had been so successful, they released the Game Boy Color, which was kind of a step up. It was smaller, it allowed you to play games in colour, which was obviously really exciting. And then after that, they also released the Game Boy Advance. So they'd been kind of on the Game Boy model for quite a while, and they really knew what they were doing with handheld consoles.
Not long following the release of the GameCube, Hiroshi Yamauchi stepped down as president of Nintendo. After an incredibly successful run instigating the company as a household name for tech development, Hiroshi would be replaced by Satoru Iwata. Iwata's succession would mean the end of the Yamauchi family's long-running ownership.
In the early 2000s, Satoru Iwata made some changes to the way that Nintendo was run. Hiroshi Yamauchi had always created a very competitive atmosphere, but Satoru Iwata's approach was completely different. He created a very collaborative atmosphere. Satoru Iwata's business style was very influenced by the Blue Ocean strategy. He didn't want to compete with all of these video game consoles that were at the cutting edge of graphic technology. He wanted to create a new market. He wanted to do things differently.
In 2013, Hiroshi passed away. His legacy, however, would live on. Retaining a similar presentation to the original Game & Watch, 2004 brought the release of Nintendo's highest-selling console ever, the Nintendo DS.
When the Nintendo DS came out, it had two screens and kind of flipped. And this meant that you were able to use the bottom screen as kind of a touch screen, and the top screen could show something completely different. So you had the same kind of controls that you did on the Game Boy, but you were able to do a lot more. Game designers were able to make games that really utilised this new tech, and that was incredibly popular. A lot of shops sold out of the Nintendo DS when it first came out. And around the same console generation, the Nintendo Wii came out.
So the Wii was really, I don't know if anyone expected it to be as successful as it was. The funny thing about the Wii was, it wasn't the franchises that Nintendo was known for that were the reason for its success. I think the real reason for the Wii success was things like Wii Sports. It was the games that your granny could play. The people that had no gaming knowledge or vocabulary whatsoever, they saw this really fun, silly thing, waggling the Wiimotes and stuff like that, instantly. You don't have to have any gaming language at all to know how to play that. And so it opened up gaming to a whole new audience. It didn't last long because the Wii U was horribly marketed, and it couldn't really get that lightning in a bottle effect that the Wii had. But for a moment, the Wii was huge. Everyone wanted to play it. Literally everyone.
If the Nintendo DS was popular, the Nintendo Wii was wildly popular at launch. I actually worked in a game shop around that time, and we were constantly sold out of Nintendo Wiis. They really managed to corner the market on family gaming, which is something Nintendo's always been good at, but they released a lot of titles that were aimed at the whole family and not just kids. So they had things like Wii Fit and Wii Sports, which had a really low barrier to entry, and adults were often a little bit more interested in than the classic Nintendo games. And I think that meant that a lot of families saw it as a real great investment and something that they could get for the kids, but which the adults would play as well.
The DS rose to the top of the gaming world as the most popular portable console thanks to games suitable for everyone. Players all over Europe made Animal Crossing Wild World, New Super Mario Bros., and Metroid Prime Hunters bestsellers. Including Nintendogs also boosted sales as it allowed experimentation with the new voice recognition software. Games like WarioWare Smooth Moves, Endless Ocean, and Big Brain Academy Wii Degree for the Wii invited everyone to dive into the fun regardless of previous experience, while the arrival of Super Mario Galaxy and Metroid Prime 3 Corruption brought cherished Nintendo franchises back into being with the addition of new features only possible on the Wii. With the new consoles in place, the time was right to fall back from inventing new products and refining what was already made. The DS had many upgraded versions, such as the DSi and eventually the Nintendo 3DS, released in 2011.
The next console that Nintendo came up with was the Wii U, a much more powerful console with high-definition graphics. Nintendo couldn't compete with these other systems that had phenomenal graphics. Also, the name Wii U, people just thought it was an extension of the Wii. They didn't realize it was an entirely new beast. So the Wii U did not sell well.
Yeah, the Wii U was Nintendo's worst selling console. It was pretty much a disaster financially. It came off the back of the Wii, but people didn't really understand it was a new console. The idea was to kind of combine an iPad-like tablet with a games console, and when they were developing it, that idea was ahead of its time. By the time they released it, it was a bit dated. It looked like a kind of Fisher-Price version of an iPad. It never really quite gelled. It didn't really know what it was, and consumers looked at it and went, I don't know what that is or what it's about. So it was a handy step on the way to the Nintendo Switch, but as a console on its own, it just never quite clicked with anyone.
Though the new version of the Wii underperformed in sales, it provided a massive step up in graphic capabilities, an asset that went under the radar as it didn't attract the same broad audience the original Wii had done previously. The Wii U, however, was the most powerful console on the home market before the release of the PS4 and Xbox One. The gamepad was a new idea which brought the handheld advantages of the DS to a home console and paved the way for what was to come. In 2017, we were introduced to the Nintendo Switch.
So the Switch is huge. I mean, it was such a success for Nintendo because it really Nintendo took everything that it had learned from the console market, from handheld, from all its handheld expertise, everything that it had learned from the Game Boy, from the DS, from the 3DS, from everything, and it was like, why don't we take both of these and make a console that literally does both? And that was just, it's just a master move, and that's what I love about Nintendo. Nintendo doesn't really see itself as a competitor to PlayStation or Xbox. All Nintendo is interested in is interesting innovation, experimentation, and making games that are fun.
Nintendo is so known for innovating with their hardware, and the Switch was no different. All of the big console companies were coming out with innovations, but none of them were quite as different as the Switch felt. It felt like a bit of a natural progression from the Wii and the DS, but also completely new at the same time. So the thing about the Switch is it can both be a handheld console, or you can put the handheld screen into a dock that attaches to your TV and then use the controllers on the side, so it's like a home console and a handheld at the same time. And that came out with fantastic games at launch as well.
I'm a massive fan of Mario games. I never really played Zelda much when I was a kid, but I have to say Zelda Breath of the Wild is my favourite game of all time. It's incredible, and that really helped to sell Switches.
Does the Nintendo Switch hold up in terms of graphical capability when put alongside the PlayStation 5 or the Xbox Series X? No, but is it unbelievably fun? Do people love it? Do people take it everywhere they go? Absolutely. It has it doesn't really suffer all that much for the amount of games that it has access to. Nintendo third-party support has actually never been better, I don't think, than with the Switch. Traditionally, I don't think Nintendo was a very friendly third-party development platform. It was just a bit more difficult to get games onto Nintendo consoles than it was for PlayStation and Xbox, but the Switch is just fantastic. You can slot it into its port or to its dock. You can pick up where you left off seamlessly from where you were out and about. You can transition from being out playing your console on the train or wherever to going indoors, slotting it in, and there it is, exactly where you were before. It's the perfect console, I think, for a lot of kids and adults alike, because if you don't have the time or the inclination to sit down in front of a PC or a console in front of a TV in the evening, you want to just, get into bed and play your Switch, that's absolutely a thing you can do.
The Switch was an amalgamation of everything Nintendo had achieved thus far, merging the idea of a home console with a handheld device. The system was versatile, ergonomic, and capable of handling the stories the company wanted to tell.
Nintendo has always been a pioneer in the gaming world. One of the things that they do that is fantastic is they have a real focus on family gaming, and that's allowed them to stand out from the crowd sometimes when the other companies are doing something a little bit different. They're really invested in making games that are fun and creative and that everyone can play. And the other thing they do is that their consoles and their hardware is always new and always interesting. Sometimes it doesn't land as well, but when it does, it absolutely blows everything else away when it comes to innovation.
It was really Satoru Iwata professionalized Nintendo's merchandising arm and expanded into other areas and created a Nintendo theme park in Japan, and there's now another one in America, and of course the Super Mario Brothers film, which I'm very excited about. One of the reasons I really love Nintendo games is that all of the games on the other consoles really focus on guns and violence and crime. And I mean, these games look fantastic, I would love to play them. But actually, I don't want to get involved in all of that violence. I love that Nintendo don't do that.
Nintendo was a pioneer of video game quality in consoles. I mean, it essentially rewrote the video game console business model and saved the video game industry by doing so. It was a pioneer in game design. Its attention to the feel of video game mechanics really kind of upped the quality bar. Game designers back in the 80s were not that great. They would make these punishing games that, would make children cry, they were so hard. Whereas Nintendo was like, no, a game should be fair. And it seems very obvious to us now that a game should be enjoyable, not punishing, but that's not how people were making games back then. It was a pioneer in broadening out the video game audience with the Wii and the DS. Nintendo created the handheld, game. We play iPhone games and Android games now, but before smartphones came along, we were playing on Nintendo portables. It's a company that's really defined video games throughout its history. It's had an enormous shaping influence on it, and it's still going strong today. It's still setting the tone for a lot of companies. Valve's Steam Deck is quite clearly modelled on the Nintendo Switch in lots of ways. There's no escaping it.
I think Nintendo brings up feelings of nostalgia because, well, first of all, I think it's been around longer, and when Nintendo was in its early days, it was marketing games for children. But even now, kids, their first console is very often a Nintendo console. I mean, my nephews, they all have Nintendo Switches, so their nostalgia will extend to Mario, as plenty of older gamers does as well. But I think it's because, again, at the heart of every Nintendo game is that childlike curiosity and wonder at the world. That's really what makes their games sing.
Well, particularly for people of my age, we grew up with Nintendo. I'm the perfect age to have been swept up by Nintendo's ascendancy in the 1980s, and it's absolutely an indelible part of my childhood.
I think because it's tied into that feeling of childhood fun, it really just evokes a feeling of nostalgia in a lot of people, and especially people my age.
Nintendo's most important legacy is saving the video game console industry. After Atari's collapse, it was possible that game consoles would not come back. It did look like home computers would be where people played games on. Nintendo changed that. Nintendo said, no, there is still room for consoles. If Nintendo hadn't come along when they did, we'd probably all be playing on PCs at this point.
Nintendo has a remarkable philosophy to put smiles on the faces of everyone they touch. To this remarkable company, which started from humble beginnings, making consoles isn't about how much processing power they possess. It is about the stories themselves. It is about the characters and open-mindedness of all who play. To Nintendo, it is all about fun. Nothing more, nothing less.